Hello, everyone. And thank you all so much for coming along today. I'm delighted to be here in Brussels and to have the opportunity to talk a little about my work, specifically about the unpredictable and for me almost unrecognizable way that real life crashes into my fiction. I'm going to start with a question I was once asked by a journalist. Would you say, they asked, that you're an autobiographical writer? I thought about this. I was in my late 40s at the time, and I hadn't yet written any novels, but I had written a lot of short stories. I'd written, for example, about a man who tries to seduce an exhausted, overworked housewife by inventing linoleum. Another one in which I imagined Charles Dickens being bitten on the hand during a visit to an asylum by a female inmate. I'd written about a woman driven almost to madness because everything on the island where she lives is the color red. I'd written about an old car with a mind and body of its own that escapes one day without its driver from a Chicago suburb. I'd written about a man in a remote Colorado mining town who is hung for eating for Republican voters, thereby ensuring a Democratic victory in the local mayoral election. Autobiographical? No, I told the journalist, definitely not. I can see now that I was lying, or at least that I wasn't telling the truth. The stories weren't autobiographical in any strict sense. They weren't events from my life narrated by me. But I don't think the question was meant in a strict sense. I think the journalist was curious about how the stories came to be and how much of me and my life was in them. And I see now that I didn't give him a straight answer. I'd begun writing short stories in my mid-30s when I was living in the United States, first in New York and then in Chicago, with my husband Michael and 4 young children. They were insanely busy years. When babysitting allowed, I worked as a freelance journalist, and occasionally I carved out the time to read a book. I discovered for the first time in my life the great American short story writers, Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor, Bernard Malmerd, John Cheever, and the rest. And it was a revelation. This was what I had to do. What I loved most, I think, in those years was that making up stories was a way of being elsewhere, a long way from my own life. And they were full, or so it seemed to me then, of things which had nothing much to do with my real life, played out by characters I'd invented or drawn from history and put on the page with more imagination than attention to what was going on around me at the time. It really is extraordinary how you can not see what you've put of yourself into a story. But long after the interview, in that period when my kids were in their late teens and heading off to distant countries by themselves, I wrote a story that was so clearly and inescapably full of my deepest fears that I began to wonder for the first time, incredible as that might seem, what it was I was really doing. Most of my stories take a year or two to write, and many much longer than that, but this one came in an afternoon. It's extremely short. It's called Nothing Like My Nightmare. The day she left, I thought of all the things that could go wrong, that she'd lose her passport or her glasses or run out of antibacterial hand wash, or the nuns wouldn't be there to meet her and take her to the school as they'd promised. Or she'd go to the cash machine her first day in the city and it wouldn't give her any money. Or she'd get a blister on her foot, like the one she got in Solva last summer from her new sandal, and it would get infected, and she wouldn't go to the doctor in time, and it would grow gangrenous, and she'd end up having to have her leg amputated. Or she'd have brought the wrong kind of adapter, or the travel towel she'd brought from Millets would be worse than useless, or her plane would crash, exploding in a ball of black fire somewhere high above the mountains. But when we got there, the old man in the bright shawl said it was nothing like that. It just broke in two like a bread roll, spilling crumbs from the sky. It was, I suppose, a kind of amulet against disaster. One of those bargains we strike with ourselves at one time or another. If I write this catastrophe, if I imagine it in technicolor and put it down in black and white on the page, it can never happen. But it was also, I think, the first time I understood that writing in all those other stories about made up people, often in the distant past and in far away, sometimes fantastical places, was a way of worrying about the here and now, a kind of continuous, constantly moving back and forth with life and the world. Every story grows out of the time in which you write it. If you'd written it at a different time, it would be a different story. In retrospect, I can see that I should probably have recognized myself in the exhausted mother being seduced by the offer of a square of easy to clean lino, or the woman going a bit crazy on the Red Island, or the beaten up old Chevrolet slouching down the street, past Walgreens, past Dunkin' Donuts, rolling west across the desert, taking in the sights, Mesa Verde, the Hoover Dam, Vegas, nosing north across the border into the cool air of the Rockies, making a break for it. And casting my mind back into the early noughties of the George W. era, I probably should have recognized myself in the Republican eating Colorado cannibal too. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend the next 45 minutes parsing everything I've ever written, looking for parallels between my own life and the lives of my characters. That's not what I'm interested in. What I do think is interesting is the alchemy of real life, an imagination of our private and public worlds, and how it feels to be caught up in the march of history and tangled up in what can be named and identified as ideas, but are only experienced as experience. Once a story or a novel is written and making its way into the world, you find that all sorts of abstract nouns suddenly come into play to describe it. A critical urge that comes partly, I think, with the business of publishing to explain them as much as, and sometimes more, in terms of ideas rather than in terms of story. In my case, the abstract nouns that usually crop up are extinction, settlement, colonization, complicity, solitude, faith, love, death. But stories aren't made of abstract nouns. They're made of what arrives on the page in words and sentences. They're made of what people and sometimes animals think and do and say to each other, almost always at a particular time and in a particular place. And in the end, it doesn't matter in fiction where all that has come from. What matters is that where it's come from makes it possible for the story to be told in the particular way that it's told. I love what one of my favorite writers, the brilliant Flannery O'Connor, had to say about all of this. I prefer, she said, to talk about the meaning of a story rather than the theme of a story. People talk about the theme of a story as if the theme were like the string that a sack of chicken feed is tied with. They think that if you can pick out the theme the way you pick the right thread in the chicken feed sack, you can rip the story open and feed the chickens. But this is not the way meaning works in fiction. When you can state the theme of a story, when you can separate it from the story itself, then you can be sure the story is not a very good one. The meaning of the story has to be embodied in it, has to be made concrete in it. A story is a way to say something that can't be said in any other way. And it takes every word in the story to say what the meaning is. You tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. When anybody asks you what a story is about, the only proper thing is to tell him to read the story. Now, I think it's a bit harsh to say that being able to pick out the theme of a story is the litmus test of it being a bad one. What she's really getting at, though, is a different and more important truth, which is that you can't express or capture a story's meaning by talking or writing about it. Only the story can do that. Otherwise, we wouldn't need the story or any kind of art. We wouldn't need stories or novels or poems or plays or painting or music. She puts it so simply: a story is a way to say something that can't be said any other way. I can only speak for myself, but I think that way of saying something is above all an act of imagination. And because the imagination works so strangely and so unpredictably, and thrives as much on unconscious emotions and associations and memories and experience as on precise observations and little pieces of knowledge, it's often really hard to unpick after you've written a story how it was that it came to be. As I said, I can only speak for myself. But when I'm writing something, I'm not constantly thinking, what is this about? I always knew that my first novel, West, had started with a fascinating little piece of historical gold I came across in the journals of Lewis and Clark, the two explorers dispatched in 1804 by President Thomas Jefferson to explore the vast uncharted territories west of the Mississippi River, which the United States had recently acquired from France. The journals themselves are actually surprisingly dull, but an almost throwaway detail in the preface caught my imagination: that before the explorers set off, Jefferson secretly asked them to keep a lookout for woolly mammoths while they were gone. Mysterious giant bones had been turning up in a Kentucky swamp, and the president fervently hoped the kind of enormous creatures they belonged to might still be alive in the West. Partly because he was curious, he was an avid paleontologist, but also because he was in the middle of a furious row with the French over who had the biggest animals, the old world or the new. A leading French naturalist had recently published a book about how small and degenerate American animals were compared with those in the old world, where they had things like elephants and giraffes. And unfortunately for Jefferson, the book had become a bestseller in Europe. It was all very embarrassing, and Jefferson desperately needed the woolly mammoths to be found alive so he could win the argument, put a stop to this humiliation, and once and for all, make America great again. I was intrigued by the silliness of Jefferson's spat with the French, but mostly I was captivated by this hope that something extinct might not actually be extinct. I loved the existential curiosity of it all. And I was so touched by the sadness of knowing from my vantage point 200 years later that this quest to find living animals was doomed before it had even started. It was one of those little historical details that drops you straight into the head of someone from another time. I began to imagine a man, a widowed English settler called Cy Bellman, who decides to head off into the West, as Lewis and Clark had done without success a few years before, to look for the mammoths. As I wrote, I read. In the archives of the New York Public Library, I read speeches and letters and diaries and newspaper reports, treaties and land transfer documents, and looked at maps and lots of other pieces of paper that catalogue this period of American history when the frontier of the United States was pushing its way further and further west. And as I followed Cy mile after mile, sentence after sentence on his journey, I did begin to realize what the story was at least partly about. I realized that Cy's guide in the wilderness, a 15-year-old Shawnee boy called Old Woman from a Distance, had been removed along with his family from their ancestral lands in Pennsylvania, the same land, in fact, where Cy had built his farm. And that this story, at least in part, had to do with settlement and dispossession and a different sort of extinction. And all this is very important in the novel, played out through the uneasy relationship between Cy and the boy. And much of the meaning of the story comes from their relationship. But it wouldn't by itself have given the story what I think of as its whole meaning, that way of saying something that can't be said in any other way, without it being bound up with something that had happened in my life. What this real life thing was, I didn't realize until long after I'd finished the book. And it was this. Just before my husband and I had left the UK, where we were living then, to spend a year in New York, our youngest daughter had graduated from university. She had no job, and once we'd rented the family home out from under her feet, nowhere to live. We packed her off to London to look for work and rent a cheap room to live in. On the railway platform in our small northern town, she cried. Huge tears slid down over her cheeks, and I'm not exaggerating when I say they splashed onto her coat. We hugged her and kissed her and waved her off, and if we felt guilty and were worrying about how she'd manage, we didn't let it stop us from going home to finish our packing and catch our plane to America. It really is incredible to me how you can not see why you've written something the way you have until long after the event. But I just wanted to read you the opening scene of West, which I wrote after I got to New York, in which Cy, my English settler, following the death of his wife, Elsie, is setting off on his quest to look for the mammoths. From what she could see, he had 2 guns, a hatchet, a knife, his rolled blanket, the big tin chest, various bags and bundles, one of which she supposed contained her mother's things. How far must you go? That depends. On where they are? Yes. So how far? 1,000 miles? More than 1,000 miles? More than 1,000 miles. I think so, Bess, yes. Bellman's daughter was twirling a loose thread that hung down from his blanket, which until this morning had lain upon his bed. She looked up at him. And then the same back. The same back, yes. She was quiet a moment, and there was a serious, effortful look about her, as if she was trying to imagine a journey of such magnitude. That's a long way. Yes, it is. But worth it if you find them. I think so, Bess, yes. He saw her looking at his bundles and his bags and the big tin chest, and wondered if she was thinking about Elsie's things. He hadn't meant her to see him packing them. She was drawing a circle in the muddy ground with the toe of her boot. So, how long will you be gone? A month? More than a month? Bellman shook his head and took her hand. Oh, Bess, yes, more than a month. A year at least. Maybe 2. Bess nodded. Her eyes smarted. This was much longer than she'd expected, much longer than she'd hoped. In 2 years, I will be 12. 12, yes. He lifted her up then and kissed her forehead and told her goodbye. and in another moment he was aloft on his horse in his brown wool coat and his high black hat. And then he was off down the stony track that led away from the house, already heading in a westerly direction. "Look you long and hard, Bess, at the departing figure of your father," said her Aunt Julie from the porch in a loud voice like a proclamation. "Regard him, Bess, this person, this fool, my brother John Cyrus Bellman, for you will not clap eyes upon a greater one. From today I am numbering him amongst the lost and the mad. Do not expect that you will see him again, and do not wave. It will only encourage him and make him think he deserves your good wishes. Come inside now, child, close the door, and forget him." For a long time, Bess stood, ignoring the words of her Aunt Julie, watching her father ride away. In her opinion, he did not resemble any kind of fool. In her opinion, he looked grand and purposeful and brave. In her opinion, he looked intelligent and romantic and adventurous. He looked like someone with a mission that made him different from other people. And for as long as he was gone, she would hold this picture of him in her mind, up there on his horse with his bags and his bundles and his weapons, up there in his long coat and his stovepipe hat, heading off into the west. She did not ever doubt that she would see him again. Bess, of course, is not my daughter, no more than I am Cy. And I'm not for a minute suggesting that this was some kind of transposed reenactment of real life. West is a work of imagination. I made it up. But the imagination is mysterious, it does its own thing. And that can often feel almost magical. What happened with my daughter is actually pretty banal compared with what happens to Bess. But still, it's impossible when I read that scene and everything that comes after it, not to think I was doing the whole amulet thing again, but in a slightly different way, hoping that our daughter wouldn't hate us forever for abandoning her, and that she would always, always think the best of us. In any event, the novel is shot through with feelings of guilt and worry and fear and hope and doubt and love. And if I had to come up with a synonym for the word meaning, I think more than anything, it might be emotion. The way a story touches us in a manner that no statement or description ever could. Here's Cy again, much later on in his journey, when he and his teenage guide, old woman from a distance, are wandering fruitlessly around in the wilderness. He was becoming afraid that he would never find them, that they were not out here after all. That whatever mystery surrounded their disappearance was buried in the briny, sulphurous ground in the east, with that shipwreck of tusks and bones he'd read about in the newspaper. That whatever the mystery was, he would not uncover it. There'd been a few brief moments not long ago when he was sure they'd come upon them at last, a big sudden movement up ahead, a frantic disturbance in the trees, branches being pulled and snapped, a spray of twigs, a swishing and a tossing and a noisy kind of chomping. He'd signed to the boy to stop, put his fingers to his lips, his heart beating very fast, all the trees tossing their leaves and branches, timber falling, and then, oh, only the wind, only thunder rolling in and lashing rain, and in the distance lightning, a spectacle of crackling white light in the darkening sky. He began to feel that he might have broken his life on this journey, that he should have stayed at home with the small and the familiar, instead of being out here with the large and the unknown. There were times now when he would stop and look around at the fantastical rocks and shivering grasses and wonder how it was possible that he was standing in such a place. There were times when steam rose up in twisting plumes from beneath the earth, when the lush plains around them shimmered and swam beneath the sculptured rocks like the ocean. One morning after they'd set off, he stopped after only a few paces, overcome by the watery twinkling of the emptiness ahead. "Sometimes, old woman," he said softly, "I feel I am all at sea." At night, in the firelight, he watched the shadows come and go across the boy's illuminated face, which seemed to him to be both young and very ancient, and thought, "What is it like to be you?" He felt again the dizzying weight of all the mystery of the earth and everything in it and beyond it. He felt the resurgence of his curiosity and his yearning, and at the same time felt more and more afraid that he would never find what he'd come for, that the monsters, after all, might not be here. With his finger, he traced the pattern of flowers that wound its way around the circumference of Elsie's thimble, round like the world, and wished himself home again. He rubbed the dull greening metal with his thumb, closed his eyes, and thought of Bess and wished. Opened his eyes to the treeless desert he had come to, and the boy moving around their camp, tidying up and hovering over the kettle on the fire. I spoke earlier about novels being a kind of continuous, constantly changing back and forth with life and the world, a way of worrying about them. And while I was in New York that year, writing about Cy and Bess and Aunt Julie, an old woman from a distance, another story came back to me, a true one that I'd been told back in 2010, when I was living for a short time in Uti, a former British hill station in the Nilgiri Mountains in Tamil Nadu in South India. Something that had happened not long before I'd arrived there. Two young boys, aged 6 and 10, from one of the local schools had travelled east to a different state to stay with their father, an Australian Christian missionary called Graham Staines. Together, father and sons set off in the family station wagon to join a Bible camp in the jungle near the small tribal village of Manaharpur. It was a long journey, and on the way they paused to rest. It was very cold, so they decided to sleep in the car, where they were found by a gang of around 50 Hindu nationalists who attacked them with axes and tridents and then burned them alive inside the vehicle. Since leaving India, I'd been writing on and off about a depressed Englishman, a librarian from the London suburbs, who, in the way that Westerners often do, heads off to India, hoping it will make him feel better somehow. I'd given him a sister, Wynne, and made up a name for him, Hilary Bird, and I'd sent him to Uti. I'd given him the bungalow that had been my home and sent him to all the places I used to go, the botanical gardens and the post office, the cinema, the chocolate shop, the English language bookstore. But it was only now, in New York, in the winter of 2016, that I began to have a sense of what his story might be. I was still reeling from the shock of the Brexit vote that summer, a result which I should have seen coming, but like so many people in the UK, hadn't. And now something else at least no one I knew in New York, really thought would actually happen, had happened. Donald Trump was the president. It made me think about Graham Staines and the boys again, and about being in India just a few years before Modi came to power on his Hindu nationalist agenda, and how when I was there, I hadn't seen the signs that that was going to happen either. I had an overwhelming sense of having been blind, both to what had been gathering momentum in India and to what had been building in the West on both sides of the Atlantic. It made me think of an essay George Orwell wrote in the 1940s about how good we are as humans at ignoring things and how it takes a constant struggle to see what's in front of our noses. The Mission House is a novel about this man, Hilary Bird, who, like me, fails to see things until they're staring him in the face. The book came out in the US in 2021, just after the storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Reviews talk mostly about empire and its consequences, and that is important in the novel. It's undoubtedly partly what it's about, but the meaning of the story, the thing that can't be said in any other way, is something different, I think, and to be found in the to and fro between Hilary Bird and the people he meets. Because it isn't just the simmering political tensions all around him that Bird fails to notice. He's blind to everything. He's so wrapped up in himself that he misjudges everyone. He thinks people want things from him when they don't. He thinks they return his feelings when they don't. He thinks they don't have feelings when they do. He sees things either as he wants them to be or as he's afraid they might be. Here he is, one evening, at the home of the local Christian padre, who has taken him under his wing and given him a place to live. The padre is anxious to find a husband for his adoptive daughter, Priscilla, who for various reasons is not very marriageable. And the padre here, after he and Bird have eaten dinner together in the presbytery, has invited Bird upstairs to have a look at something. The trunk was blue and made of tin, like 100 others Bird had seen piled up in towers at the market and strapped beneath flapping tarpaulins to the roof racks of buses. The padre opened it. Did Mr. Bird know what it was? Bird hesitated. He was fairly sure he did. In spite of the meagre contents he could see inside, he was fairly certain he knew exactly what it was. Yes, said Bird. His mother and his aunt would have called it a hope chest. Inside was some embroidered tablecloths, an electric kettle, a thin roll of cash in a brown rubber band, a white saucer with a small quantity of gold jewelry on it. For Priscilla on her wedding day, said the padre. Whenever I can, I pop something in. The two men stood in silence. Bird didn't know what to say. He had the feeling the padre was waiting for him to offer up a comment, but he had no idea what the right thing might be. He shifted the position of his feet and replaced across the top of his head a loose, thin strand of hair that had flopped down over his ear. He wondered if he was being invited to make a contribution of some sort, a pair of earrings perhaps, or an electric food mixer, or some cash. The price he was paying to stay in the little mission house was very low, far lower than he would have to pay at the Nasri Hotel or the Savoy. The padre had called it the missionary rate. Perhaps, thought Bird, he was being asked now to pay a little more on top, either in cash or in kind. Downstairs in the kitchen, he could hear Priscilla stumping about in her big boot. When I'm gone, Mr. Bird, the padre said softly, she will have no one. Bird swallowed. He felt the familiar mixture of guilt and anxiety which had so oppressed him when he'd been hustled by the crowds of auto rickshaw drivers down on the plains and on his first day here in the mountains, all of them demanding more money than he wanted to give. He wondered what kind of thing the padre had in mind, how little cash he could offer, how inexpensive a gift without appearing mean. No doubt the padre thought of him as a wealthy man. No doubt everyone here thought the tourists who came were rich as Croesus. But Hilary Bird did not feel rich. No decision had yet been reached with the library about him taking his pension early. His only funds were his modest savings and the envelope of cash Wynne had pressed on him at the airport. He wished Wynne was with him. Wynne would know what to say and what to give, and how to deal lightly and easily with the situation. He looked down at his feet. The words from his guidebook came back to him. Do not make eye contact. If you make eye contact, you are lost. Padre, he began uncertainly, and without looking up, But the padre interrupted him with a sigh. A couple of years ago, Mr. Bird, I thought I had found someone, but it was not to be. After that, the padre stood for what seemed like a long moment, gazing down into the chest at the kettle and the tablecloths, the roll of money and the saucer of jewelry, as if willing them to proliferate in a magical way. Bird was relieved when at last the old clergyman reached for the edge of the lid and pulled it shut and said, "Come, Mr. Bird, it is late. You must be tired and wanting your bed." And we'll leave Bird there, I think, but needless to say, everything becomes a bit more complicated later on. Nearly every writer I know has what they loosely call their COVID novel, or whatever it was they wrote during that strange period. For a long time, I didn't write anything. Letters, a few essays, but no fiction. It was like a kind of paralysis. Everything I wrote felt made up in a bad and pointless way. Eventually, I retreated into a dictionary I'd stumbled across about a decade previously. Roughly 10,000 words in an extinct language called Norn that used to be spoken on the islands of Orkney and Shetland off the far north coast of Scotland before it started to die out in the middle of the 15th century when the Danish king pawned the islands to Scotland. I'd found the dictionary one evening in the library in Edinburgh, where I live, and for years I'd been going back to it, reading it and making lists of words and their definitions. Now I started writing scenes up and out, as it were, of the words themselves, extraordinarily precise and transporting words like hos, which means a muffled murmur. Excuse me, one moment. A slight sore throat. Hos, which means a muffled murmur or the sound of waves lapping the shore in calm weather. Groma, which means a light mist with rifts through which blue sky can be seen. Ataford, a bubble of foam on the grass in the hill pasture containing an insect. I imagined a man called Ivar living alone on a tiny island in the middle of the North Sea with only a few sheep and chickens, his old blind cow and his horse Peggy for company. Such a remote place that Norn, in my imagination, had survived there into the 19th century. And Ivar was its last speaker. I imagined that when the rest of his family had either died or left the island years before, he'd decided to stay on, alone. I know I said earlier that when I write, I'm not asking myself, what is this about? That said, it was obvious to me that I was writing in some way about language and precariousness and beauty and a sense of home. And I knew that a huge part of the story's meaning would come from that. A meaning I could never have found or tried to capture by any other means than through the words in Ivar's language. But meaning never comes from just one thing. And although I don't think I realized it at the time, that I was also writing about from the experience of being quarantined, I can't read the book clear now without thinking that I must have been. The story unfolds during the Highland clearances in Scotland, when during the 18th and 19th centuries, landowners were evicting their small, poor tenants from their estates so sheep could be grazed instead. A minister, John Ferguson, has arrived on the island to deliver Ivar's eviction notice. But almost as soon as he gets there, he falls off a cliff and is found unconscious by Ivar, who takes him home and begins to care for him. He's the first person Ivors had any contact with for 20 years, ever since his family left and he chose to stay. And he has no idea yet why John has come. Here he is, a few weeks after John's arrival. In the early dawn, he stepped outside. He'd hardly been out since the day he brought John Ferguson home. But today, while John Ferguson slept, he went into the home field and began to weed the enclosure where the young cabbages were growing, pulling out wall barley and conium, oat grass and hemlock, and throwing them in a heap against the wall for burning. Then he fetched Peggy from the byre, and they brought the peats home from the round hill, and he stacked them on the ledge outside the house. And when he'd finished, he walked up by himself to the top of the peaked hill and looked out across the water. Far below, the sea heaved and slapped against the rocks, one long swell after another. Further out, it broke over the skerries and eddied between them. Above, he could hardly see the sky for the mass of gannets lifting. He had not thought of himself as being lonely or even alone. He had never regretted what he'd done in staying and had grown used to being by himself. It had not felt like a decision or a choice, and in that sense, it had not been hard. There was nothing that Jenny or his mother or his grandmother had been able to say, no picture of another life they'd been able to paint that any part of him had been able to respond to. Which isn't to say he didn't long for them or think about them or try to see them in his mind's eye or wish they hadn't left. It isn't to say he didn't sometimes stand inside the thick stone walls of the house and try to summon the sensation of being surrounded by people he loved. It isn't to say he didn't feel a little low when summer began to give way to the slow beginning of winter, when it was the end of the short nights, the beginning of the long ones, when most of the birds were gone and the geese had not yet arrived. And he said to Peggy, "Well, Peggy, 'tis just you and me again." Peggy, who'd been given to him when he was a boy and whose name he'd been allowed to choose. Peggy, who was his helper and his constant companion, and was even older now than the black cow. Last winter, when he'd been ill, he'd thought about his own death and what it would be like for there to be no one to wash him, as his mother and his grandmother had washed the skin and bone bodies of his father and Jenny's little boy, and wrap him as they'd wrapped them in a knitted shawl and lower him into a hole in the island's cool, familiar earth and cover him over with a quilt of soil and stones. Now this. He stood for a long time in the softly falling rain, and eventually he spoke to himself silently inside his own head. I have the cliffs and the skerries and the birds. I have the white hill and the round hill and the peaked hill. I have the clear spring water and the rich good pasture that covers the tilted top of the island like a blanket. I have the old black cow and the sweet grass that grows between the rocks. I have my great chair and my sturdy house. I have my spinning wheel, and I have my teapot, and I have Peggy. And now, amazingly, I have John Ferguson too. I'm not living in Edinburgh this year. For the time being, I'm living in Paris. At least physically, I am. In my imagination, I'm spending most of my time in Antarctica. Let me explain. Of all the years I've talked about tonight, the last one has been the most momentum because in the summer of 2024, my husband Michael died. There was a year when we thought he'd get better and a year when we knew he wouldn't. And during both of them, I was always writing something, different things, without having much idea what they were. I wondered at the beginning of it all if I should be keeping a diary. Time was so precious. Shouldn't I record it? But after a couple of brief entries, I abandoned it. I love other people's diaries. I've been carrying around Helen Garner's brilliant ones with me for months now, and they're so full of wisdom and insight and humor. But keeping one, writing life about life in that way through that means doesn't seem to be for me. And during those 2 years, I had no interest in recording and examining things. I was only interested in living them. It did make me think there might be something at least a little bit true in what Henry James said, that if you have to write down something that struck you, it probably hasn't struck you. Michael was always my first reader, and about 6 weeks before he died, I read him about 20 pages of something I'd been writing. He knew before I read it to him that it had something to do with Antarctica, because we'd been rummaging around together in all the secondhand bookshops in Edinburgh, looking for interesting books, and he'd bought me a few. He knew all about my fascination with the frozen South, with the journals of Captain Scott and the men who lived and died with him, with Ernest Shackleton's hair-raising and astonishing trip to safety after the Endurance became stuck in the ice in the Weddell Sea. Over the years, he'd already brought me a pile of memoirs by whaling captains and sealing captains and big, colourful books about the animals and birds that live in that faraway place, which is so hostile to humans. I had no idea what the story was that I was writing. And after I'd read it to him aloud, with him lying on the sofa and me sitting next to him, I was very discouraged by it. Almost all of it felt like something I'd already read somewhere else before. But there was a short paragraph that to both of us was alive and interesting and full of possibility in a way that none of the rest was. One of the many books Michael had bought me way back in 1997 for my birthday was called The Reminiscences of Captain Joseph Fuller, an American whaling captain from New London who was shipwrecked while hunting elephant seal in Antarctica in the 1880s. Fuller writes well, and there's lots to enjoy about his dealings with the grumpy, mutinous crew of his ship, the Pilot's Bride. But one little detail interested me more than any other, and that was when he finally makes it to Cape Town. His mother-in-law is there. Why, I can't remember. I'm not sure Fuller even tells us, but he ends up having to take her back to the United States on another ship. In his account, it's all over in a couple of brief lines. We never get to find out how they get on that long journey back. But I love that. You survive an Antarctic shipwreck, and your reward is an 8,000-mile trip home with your mother-in-law. When I'd finished reading the short paragraph I'd written, loosely based on Fuller's experience, Michael said, "I like that bit." And I said, "Yeah, I like it too." "You should keep going," he said, and I did. And then after he died, something completely unexpected happened. Our youngest son announced that he was coming to live with me for a year. He'd quit his teaching job in Philadelphia to come and be with me in Edinburgh. So there we were, mother and son, cooking and eating together, doing our laundry, going out for cups of coffee, to the cinema, for walks on the beach and in the hills. He'd just turned 34, and it was 15 years since we'd lived together under the same roof. Then inevitably the time eventually came for him to return to his life, and I decided to move to Paris to spend 9 months at Columbia University's Institute for Ideas in Imagination, where I am now. That rough paragraph I read to Michael has changed a lot since. The biggest change perhaps being that the mother-in-law has morphed into a mother. And rather than being thrown together at the end of one journey and the start of another, my two characters, mother and son, are with each other from the outset. There's still a huge amount I don't know about the story. What I do know is that the son's name is Robert and the mother's name is Francis, and that he's heading to Antarctica to hunt seals at a time when, because of the overhunting that went on throughout the 19th century in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, there are barely any seals left to hunt.
Caris Davis, vous avez, on passe au français puisque, comme c'était annoncé, c'est une soirée qui est organisée avec, votre éditeur, votre éditrice française, qui est ici ce soir, aux éditions de la Table Ronde et puis, vous êtes en résidence à Paris et vous m'avez confié avoir envie de vous exercer, vous entraîner, vous parlez très, très bien français. Donc je l'ai dit, vous avez, grandi au Pays de Galles, puis, dans les Midlands. Avant de partir aux États-Unis, vous avez travaillé pendant, 12 ans. Vous êtes l'autrice de 3 romans dont on a entendu, des extraits. Votre premier roman West, a obtenu le prix du livre de l'année au Pays de Galles. Votre deuxième livre, Le voyage de Hilary Bird, a été élu roman de l'année 2020 par le Sunday Times. Éclairci, votre troisième livre à nous arriver en français, il est sorti, l'année dernière aux éditions de la Table Ronde, toujours d'ailleurs dans une traduction française de David Fauconberg, il faut le dire, qui a, accepté donc, de traduire ce texte, de cette conférence pour nous. Et donc Éclairci a quant à lui remporté le prix du meilleur livre étranger en 2025. Il est en cours de traduction en 8 langues. Alors vous avez écrit beaucoup de nouvelles qui ont été aussi, récompensées par de nombreux prix. Elles ont été diffusées sur, BBC, Radio et publiées notamment dans Granta, The Dublin Review and The Seeing Fly et vous vivez aujourd'hui à Édimbourg, enfin à
C'est
Paris.
c'est
C'est bien
ça
ça?
marche
Ça
le
marche.
micro? Oui, à nouveau, c'est ça.
Je voulais vous remercier vraiment pour cette, prise de parole ce soir. Merci à Marina Philippard aussi pour cette peinture et son sens du timing. Parfait. Hem, En plus d'être très, très sensible et de m'avoir, personnellement beaucoup émue, cette conférence est très éclairante sur le processus d'écriture, et en particulier sur, le processus de métabolisation qui est à l'œuvre quand on écrit, le processus, psychique qui transvase un peu des éléments de la vie vers la littérature et l'inverse. Et je trouve que le savoir n'ôte rien au plaisir qu'on peut avoir en vous lisant. Bien au contraire, on en ressort, admiratif et éclairé. Hem, Ce soir, on a entendu un passage de votre, prochain roman,
Oui.
mais à votre demande, ce passage n'a pas été reproduit dans le livret, dans la traduction française de David Fauconberg, puisque vous aviez envie de ne pas vous sentir, coincé, et de ne pas avoir imprimé une version qui pourrait encore changer par la suite, bien sûr.
Oui, et j'ai toujours peur que tout ça va partir en fumée. Oui,
Fuité.
c'est un processus très fragile.
Et en ce sens, c'était vraiment un inédit, un cadeau, volatile que vous nous avez fait ce soir. Je trouve ça très beau parce que dans quelques années, quand on pourra lire ce nouveau livre, on pourra comparer le souvenir qu'on a gardé de cette lecture au texte finalement imprimé et effectivement, peut-être, ce passage aura subi des transformations de détails. Peut-être
Oui.
ce sera tout à fait autre. Peut-être sera-t-il devenu carrément inutile dans l'économie du livre. Peut-être aura-t-il disparu. Et du coup, je voulais vous poser cette première question. Jusqu'à combien de versions d'un même livre écrivez-vous, Caris Davis? Est-ce que c'est
Ouais.
douloureux d'arrêter de transformer un texte? Et est-ce que vous avez peur parfois de modifier vos textes, éternellement?
Ah non, à la dernière question, je dirais, comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure, je crois que on écrit, l'histoire qu'on écrit, c'est l'histoire qu'on écrit à un moment. Et puis, bah, il faut accepter que la perfection est impossible et il faut continuer avec la vie, écrire d'autres histoires dans d'autres moments. Euh,
Et
mais,
jusqu'à
mais, mais,
combien
je,
de oui.
je ne pense pas vraiment euh, à version, c'est beaucoup plus chaotique que ça. Euh, je, je suis toujours un peu émerveillée par les auteurs qui parlent de une première 1re version, une, 3e version, c'est pas du tout comme ça. Je J'écris des scènes, j'écris des phrases, des paragraphes et petit à petit, ça commence à s'adhérer. Mais le début est très, très, très important pour moi. Avant de trouver le début, par exemple, en éclaircie, le début, c'est le moment où, le pasteur arrive sur l'île et c'était après peut-être, 7 ou 8 ans que j'ai écrit cette scène et je me suis dit: «Ça, c'est le début». J'ai commencé. Oui, c'est souvent très long de trouver le vrai début.
Le vrai début, oui, parce que c'est
Oui,
ça, ça peut être,
oui.
un passage en cours. Hem, alors je suis très contente de parler avec vous ce soir parce que c'est très rare d'entendre finalement une écrivaine entre 2 livres. C'est-à-dire que là, on vous saisit un peu à un moment intéressant. On n'est plus dans l'immédiate promotion, si je puis dire, de d'Éclaircie, votre dernier texte traduit en français. Voilà, des tournées promotionnelles qui sont parfois, enfin, souvent très sollicitantes, dans laquelle c'est difficile d'écrire pour un auteur. Hem, mais là, vous êtes déjà dans l'écriture d'un nouveau livre. Et du coup, je me demandais, est-ce que l'écriture, c'est, une activité, un processus continu dans votre vie? Ou est-ce que vous restez parfois de longs mois sans écrire?
Non, pas de long, non, j'écris, tout le temps, mais ça change, c'est-à-dire je lis beaucoup, et ça dépend de la phase, où je suis avec, un roman. En ce moment, par exemple, j'essaie de assembler un peu, le chaos que j'ai créé. Alors, j'écris, beaucoup en ce moment, tous les jours, mais il faut aussi, avoir du temps à rêver. C'est très important de ne pas être trop pressé, il faut avoir beaucoup de patience et de mais non, j'aurais peur de ne pas écrire pendant une semaine, par exemple.
Ça, ce serait effrayant.
Oui.
Est-ce que vous avez déjà eu l'impression justement que vous ne parviendrez enfin, que vous ne parviendriez plus jamais à écrire? Est-ce que vous avez déjà eu cette,
Heu, oui, oui, ça arrive souvent que je pense: «Mais je ne trouverai rien qui m'intéresse, qui m'excite», parce que si on n'est pas, un peu si je suis pas obsédée, un peu folle, je n'arrive pas à être, intéressée.
vous nous avez parlé de vos inspirations, certaines de vos inspirations, mais ce qu'on a vu aussi, se dessiner pendant votre prise de parole, c'était, me semble-t-il, la variété des lieux, la variété des pays dans lesquels vous avez emmené vos lectrices au fil de vos livres, hein, l'archipel des Shetland tout au nord
Mmh.
de l'Écosse, le sud de l'Inde, la Pennsylvanie, le Kentucky. Mais il y a aussi la variété des endroits d'où vous écrivez, qui me semble très intéressante parce que cette variété est très grande, pas forcément en résonance d'ailleurs avec le cadre des livres que vous y écrivez.
Mmh.
Hem, vous avez écrit au Royaume-Uni, à New York, Chicago, au sud de l'Inde.
Oui.
On l'a dit, vous êtes actuellement en résidence d'écriture à Paris, d'où
Mmh.
vous écrivez sur l'Antarctique. On sent quand même un sens du voyage chez vous, hein, de la mouvance, historiquement. Vous vous
Mmh.
déplacez
Mmh.
dans le temps, géographiquement, vous
Oui.
bougez, vous vous déplacez et j'aimerais du coup vous interroger sur la
Mmh.
partie fixe dans l'écriture, celle qui est, rassurante, récurrente,
Mmh.
inchangée. À quoi ressemble, une journée d'écriture à Paris, à New York, en Inde? Qu'ont-elles en commun? Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire de vos habitudes
Oui,
d'écriture?
oui, où que je suis, les jours sont à peu près pareils, ce que j'aime surtout, c'est de me réveiller, de ne pas m'habiller, de manger mon petit déjeuner toujours en pyjama et commencer à écrire et me trouver à 3 4 heures, de l'après-midi, toujours en pyjama, toujours écrivant. Ça pour moi, c'est l'apogée d'une journée d'écriture. Mais non, en ce moment, à Paris, j'appartiens, dans un sens à un institut et j'ai un bureau à l'institut. J'y vais chaque jour, entre lundi et vendredi. C'est comme un job, oui, et j'aime beaucoup cette routine, et avant d'écrire, des nouvelles et des romans, j'étais journaliste et je crois que ça m'a donné heu, une sorte de discipline, heu, parce qu'il faut être, oui, il faut être
Au
discipliné.
rendez-vous.
Oui.
Mmh. Alors je vais évidemment pas vous demander de quoi parle votre texte, hein, on est
Mmh.
d'accord? En revanche, j'avais envie de vous interpeller à cet endroit qui est l'écriture, ce qui est rare finalement, pour vous demander si c'est vous seriez d'accord de nous partager quelque chose de ce processus tout à fait en cours, peut-être fragile, et
Mmh.
peut-être vous serez pas d'accord.
Mmh.
Mais en particulier, j'avais envie de vous demander si, vous auriez envie de nous expliquer à propos du texte en cours,
Mmh.
hem, une chose, un aspect, une idée
Oui.
dont vous seriez particulièrement satisfaite? Et peut-être ou
Oui.
bien un
Oui.
problème concret que vous pose le texte
Oui.
actuellement?
Oui. Ben, un problème, c'est que malgré mon intérêt, à cette région, heu, je n'y je suis jamais allée là-bas. Alors, heu, chaque jour, je pense: «Mais il y a tant de choses que je ne connais pas», mais je trouve que je trouve toujours qu'il faut une sorte de distance, de l'imagination, et oh, comme écrivain, on 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 n'a pas besoin de tout savoir. Trop savoir, ça peut devenir un fardeau, et je peux donner un exemple. J'ai passé, les mois d'octobre, novembre, décembre en lisant beaucoup je connais pas le mot en français, mais les, logs, les ba les sur les ship's logs, hem, les oui,
Dans les canaux? Ah les, est-ce que quelqu'un l'a? Je sais pas.
oui, oui, le jour
Les
oui,
journaux
voilà,
de
les journaux,
merci.
des navires. Alors j'en ai beaucoup lu, pendant ces 3 mois, les journaux de cette période, à la fin du 19e siècle. Mais à la fin de, 2-3 mois, je me suis dit: «Assez, c'est assez, il faut maintenant que je jette tout ça, maintenant que j'ai absorbé, maintenant il faut que je retourne à mon esprit». Heu, oui, c'est le rapport entre les recherches et l'imagination, il faut pas, je crois que les recherches peuvent détruire l'imagination si on ne fait pas attention. Alors, et maintenant, je me sens beaucoup plus libérée, les journaux m'ont donné, beaucoup de confiance, et maintenant je peux
Ça
mais
donne une assise,
oui, oui,
que s'en fier uniquement à l'imagination, ça pourrait être aussi un peu angoissant de
oui,
n'avoir aucune matière,
oui.
c'est ça? Mmh. Hem, vous donnez vie à des personnages qui ont, me semble-t-il, un rapport assez intense à la solitude. Hem, dans West, tous les personnages sont très seuls. Bess, son père, Sai, dans Éclaircie, donc Ivor vit seul sur une île, ce qui pourrait être une sorte de quintessence de l'expérience de la solitude.
Mmh.
Hem, est-ce que vous vous inspirez là de votre métier? C'est-à-dire, Hemingway a dit quelque chose sur le fait que plus vous allez loin en écriture, plus vous devenez seul. Est-ce que, c'est aussi un peu votre expérience?
Hem, bah, j'aime bien la solitude. Bah, i être, écrivain, il faut aimer la solitude parce que, il n'y a pas d'autre, méthode que d'être là avec, la page, dans une chambre. C'est comme ça que ça se fait. Hem, oui, mais est-ce que j'ai répondu à la question?
Heu,
Heu,
oui, oui, et est-ce que c'est un processus qui s'amplifie au fur et à mesure que le manuscrit prend de plus en plus forme, que vous êtes seul à connaître ce qu'il contient? Est-ce que c'est un processus qui vous rend de plus en plus seul, au fur et à mesure de l'écriture d'un livre? Avant
oui,
de le rendre public et de
heu
re-rencontrer le
oui, non, et enfin, j'ai mon rapport avec, mes personnages. Je me sens très proche en Éclaircie, par exemple. Je me sens, après plusieurs années d'être avec eux chaque jour, je me sens très proche à Ivor et John et Mary, mais on me demande toujours si je vais si je vais écrire, la suite, et je, je suis jamais je suis pas triste exactement, quand je finis un livre. Je me trouve toujours prête à les laisser, partir sans moi.
Mais justement, ces personnages que vous créez des figures très fortes, qui nous restent en tête, et avec qui je ne serais pas étonnée que certains lecteuristes continuent de cohabiter, hein, longtemps après avoir, lu un de vos livres. Alors vous acceptez de les laisser partir, mais qu'est-ce qu'ils deviennent ces personnages une fois que le livre est terminé? Quel genre de présence ils ont pour vous? Est-ce que, ça devient des entités abstraites? Est-ce que c'est comme des parents un peu éloignés? Est-ce que c'est quel des personnages avec qui vous continuez une sorte de dialogue,
Oui, 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 ils sont toujours, oui, ils existent, toujours dans mon esprit, Cy, Bess, je sens un rapport, vraiment très très fort ave avec eux, et c'est vrai que je pense à, Bess, par exemple. Je me demande, mais qu'est-ce qui va se passer après, la dernière page? Mais dans mon cœur, j'ai un sens que tout va aller bien pour elle parce elle est curieuse et forte, et bah, je ne veux pas dire, trop sur Éclaircie parce qu'il y en a ici qui n'ont pas lu la fin, mais j'ai mes propres idées, heu, sur, ce qui va arriver.
et justement vous parlez de Bess, vous parlez de Mary. J'ai l'impression que dans le genre de texte que vous écrivez, c'est-à-dire la conquête, d'un homme seul,
Mmh.
l'épopée d'un pionnier, vous faites apparaître des personnages de femmes, des personnages de femmes qui pensent, qui élaborent, des femmes parfois seules mais pas malheureuses pour autant, des
Mmh.
femmes qui ont des amitiés féminines très fortes, des femmes qui lisent. Même Bess, malgré son jeune âge dans West,
Ouais, ouais,
elle est comme ça.
ouais.
Hem, donner un rôle, à une femme comme vous le faites au milieu de genres littéraires très codifiés au masculin, me semble, en tout cas une chose nouvelle et bienvenue parce que c'est assez rare aussi dans l'histoire de ces genres littéraires-là.
Oui, ça quelque chose qui m'irrite un peu parfois dans les his les romans historiques, c'est que les femmes ont elles ont trop de pouvoir, à vrai dire, parce que Bess et Mary, elles sont, fortes, mais elles existent, dans les contraintes, de leur temps. Elles ne f elles
Très réaliste.
oui, oui, c'est très et c'est ça qui m'intéresse. Que qu'est-ce qu'elles peuvent faire? Heu, Comment vont-elles se débrouiller dans ces situations très serrées, heu, qui est si différent que, les vies de leurs hommes, le père et John, qui qui font ce qu'il fait, oui.
Oui, et elles ont du pouvoir quand même, mais
Oui, oui,
effectivement,
ils le
elles trouvent des
trouvent,
voies.
oui.
Elles sont très créatives en ça.
Mmh.
Hem, alors, mais je pense qu'on va, bientôt clore, doucement ce bref entretien, mais
Mmh.
j'avais envie de vous demander un petit peu, on a parlé de certaines de vos sources d'inspiration, mais je me demandais si, enfin, j'avais envie de prendre un peu la mesure des lectures aussi que vous faites pendant l'écriture,
Mmh.
parce que vous évoquez, on a parlé de la documentation, des lectures très documentaires, donc des
Mmh.
récits de voyage, d'expéditions, des manuels de linguistique même,
Oui.
puisque la linguistique est un
Mmh.
sujet à part entière dans Éclaircie. Mais est-ce que vous lisez aussi de la fiction, quand vous écrivez de la poésie,
Mmh.
par exemple?
Pas trop quand je excusez-moi, quand je suis en train d'écrire, mais il y a, excusez-moi, et de toute façon, je ne lirai pas parce en ce moment, par exemple, je ne lirai pas des
Sur
romans,
l'Antarctique?
mmh, exactement, même, à la mer, excusez-moi, ouais, parti.
Ce serait probablement trop proche. Mmh. Mmh.
Oui, 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 c'est pas du tout utile.
Est-ce qu'il y a des écrivains, plus jeunes que vous admirez? Est-ce que vous auriez,
Heu, oh,
est-ce que vous lisez
plus
des
jeune,
mmh
oui,
mh.
oui, j'admire beaucoup, la jeune, américaine, Emma Cline qui a
Mmh.
écrit, The Girls, en anglais, Daddy et The Guest, je crois que c'était, son dernier roman. Elle est vraiment, je la trouve incroyable, incroyablement douée. Elle est oui.
Alors peut-être encore 2 petites questions, mais il y a en tout cas, la dimension visuelle de cette conférence, grâce à Marina Philippard m'amène à questionner un peu la place de l'image pour vous, puisque dans
Ah oui.
les remerciements de Éclaircie, vous parlez des objets issus de musées comme,
Mmh.
la Scottish National Portrait Gallery, le National Museum of Scotland qui se sont emparés de votre imagination.
Oui,
Vous parlez des cartes, des lettres, des manuscrits, mais aussi des tableaux qui sont
oui.
exposés. Et du coup, je me demandais, voilà, en tant que romancière, comment est-ce que vous regardez un tableau? Qu'allez-vous y chercher? Et est-ce qu'il y a dans Éclaircie une scène, un objet que l'on devrait à une peinture, exposée au, National Museum of Scotland, par exemple?
Heu, En fait, on me demande, mes maisons d'édition me demandent toujours, quand il est temps de trouver une, couverture, elles me demandent, «Mais Caris, qu'est-ce que tu penses?» Et je dis: «Ah, ne me demandez pas, je sais pas». Mais cette fois, avec Éclaircie, j'ai dit: «Je laissez-moi penser un peu» et j'ai trouvé, ce tableau. Un c'est un peintre, heu de la Norvège et je l'ai trouvé et c'est pas tout à fait, la même période, mais quand même l'atmosphère, était pour moi, parfaite et je l'ai vue et oui, j'étais transportée à ma petite île.
Donc c'était votre choix, cette
Oui,
couverture,
oui.
ouais, qui est vraiment magnifique. Mmh. Hem, alors vous venez de la nouvelle, ça on en a parlé. Vous écrivez des romans, aussi intenses que très courts,
Mmh mh.
aussi larges que brefs. Hem, comment l'expliquez-vous et peut-être, comment arrivez-vous à cette brièveté? Est-ce que c'est un choix ou est-ce que c'est un labeur? Mmh.
Un peu les 2. J'aime beaucoup hem, j'aime beaucoup la puissance d'une phrase très courte et souvent quand j'écris, comme j'ai dit, tout à l'heure, je ne sais jamais ce qui va se passer, heu, dans mes romans et souvent, il y a une petite phrase que j'écris où tout d'un coup, tout est bouleversé par cette petite phrase et je sais, je me souviens toujours de, le moment où j'ai écrit cette phrase dans Éclaircie. Hem, je
Quelle phrase?
pourrais je peux vous dire, mais, oui, c'est le moment où je sais pas
C'est
parce
la
que
fin?
c'est pas la fin
Mmh.
exactement, mais ça c'est le moment où, le roman prend, une autre direction. Alors peut-être je ne devrais pas dire,
Je
mais
propose
c'est
que
une
ceux
toute
qui veulent ne
petite
pas
phrase.
savoir se bouchent les oreilles et vous pouvez la dire.
Oui, c'est la phrase où, Ivor, n'aurait pas pu dire, quand il a transféré ses affections de Mary à John. Et je me suis dit: «Ah, alors!» C'était une surprise et c'était une toute petite, phrase très simple, où tout a
Qui oui, qui
changé.
ouvre un monde,
Oui,
ouais.
oui.
Hem, est-ce que vous vous astreignez à couper beaucoup dans un texte originellement, je ne sais pas, une fois et demie plus vaste ou 2 fois plus long?
Ah oui,
Ou
j'écris.
est-ce que,
Mmh.
cette brièveté, c'est
Mmh.
comme une sorte d'urgence
Mmh.
aussi?
Ça dépend, il y a des scènes que j'écris, très rapidement, et elles marchent comme à peu près comme je les ai écrites, mais heu, aussi j'écris des des centaines de pages et heu, la plupart, des pages, arrivent par terre.
Ouais.
Oui.
Et qu'est-ce que vous, quel sentiment vous éprouvez quand vous devez, vraiment, oui, jeter des passages entiers, peut-être un chapitre entier? Quel sentiment ça vous donne
Ah!
de jeter, en fait, ou
Heu,
de supprimer?
de quand je dois supprimer, heu, si je sais dans mon cœur que c'est nécessaire, ça ne me fait pas de douleur. Hem, aussi rien n'est je garde tout, hein. Peut-être, il y a quelque chose que je dois jeter et
Trouvera sa
qui
place ailleurs?
qui reviendra, on ne sait jamais. Oui, en fait, il y a une scène, dans Éclaircie, c'est la scène où John et Mary se rencontrent. C'est une scène, assez, bizarre. Elle se déroule, au milieu d'un tremblement de terre et c'était une scène que j'ai écrite, originalement, heu, dans une nouvelle qui n'a pas du tout, marché. Je n'ai rien fait avec et ça se déroulait, à Chile, mais j'ai beaucoup aimé, ce moment. Je l'ai trouvé, très très fort, très romantique, mais je me suis dit: «Mais c'est dommage parce qu'il n'y a pas de tremblement de terre en Écosse». Mais si, il y en a eu un grand tremblement, heu, exactement, en 38 je crois, juste avant les événements du roman. Alors,
Vous avez dû être
il a
heureuse de découvrir
oui,
ça, ouais.
c'est magique.
Mais c'est vrai que cette scène de cette rencontre, elle a la puissance d'une nouvelle, quoi. Donc on
Mmh
comprend
mh.
mieux, heu, d'où ça vient. Mais c'est vrai que moi j'étais assez étonnée, en vous entendant, dire que vous n'aviez absolument aucune idée de la manière dont un livre se termine. Hem, alors je sais pas, je me demandais qu'est-ce que ne pas savoir vous permet? Est-ce que c'est peut-être d'être aux côtés de vos personnages qui, comme dans la vie, au fait, avancent vers l'inconnu? Hem, est-ce que c'est de ça dont il s'agit ou est-ce que c'est pas vraiment, un choix?
Un choix
C'est-à-dire qu'il y a
pour
des écrivains qui pourraient se réjouir de leur pouvoir, d'avoir
ah,
déjà
ouais,
très en tête ce qu'ils vont
oui,
faire faire à
oui.
leurs personnages?
Non, c'est plutôt que pour moi, ça ne marche pas. Si je dirige mes personnages comme ça, bah, il n'y a pas de de vie, il y a c'est plat, c'est faux, c'est alors c'est pas un choix. Je peux pas faire autrement.
Peut-être dernière question, mais sous quelle forme vous apparaissent, les fins de vos livres?
Ce qu'elle
À quel signe vous avez compris
ah,
que ça allait s'arrêter
mmh,
là, de cette
ah,
façon?
je le sens.
Ouais.
Je peux pas expliquer, mais je le sens.
On parlait tout à l'heure des jeunes écrivains, que vous pourriez, lire, admirer. Je me
Mmh.
demandais si vous aviez, voilà, un conseil, à donner à à des jeunes écrivains. Quel serait votre conseil?
Hem, de ne rien, jeter, de tout garder parce que souvent quand bah, à la fin d'une journée, j'ai toujours l'impression que j'ai écrit, des paragraphes, des phrases, des pages qui sont, bonnes et d'autres, qui sont mauvaises et le lendemain quand je les relis, c'est toujours celles que j'ai trouvées mauvaises que je trouve, meilleures et il faut jamais, jeter
Juger
de
trop vite?
oui, oui, jeter trop vite, oui.
Écrire d'abord et puis
Mmh,
voir ensuite,
oui,
ouais.
oui, mais oui et bien sûr, heu, ne craindre pas faut pas avoir peur des échecs, hein. Mmh, s l'échec, c'est très important.
Merci beaucoup. C'est une
Merci.
belle fin.